everyone, I'm Nicola Pogson, Head of Alumni Relations at Imperial College Business School, and I'm very happy to welcome you here to our webinar today. Before kicking off, I also want to just say a few words about our Career Professional Development Service. Our Career and Professional Development webinars offer ongoing professional development support to alumni wherever they are based, and they're proving very popular. And I just want to remind you that if you want to take charge of your career with the support of the CPDS team, you can have one-to-one consultations on campus by Skype, phone or email. So if you need further details of the service, check out the alumni website of the business school. Today we have 62 people registered. They're still starting to register now, but 62 registered are from around the world, from the UK, of course, but America, Canada, Brazil, China, Singapore, Greece, France, Turkey, Netherlands, Switzerland, Bulgaria, Germany, India, and Niger. So welcome to all of you. And I want to give you a few details on the webinar before we get started. It will be recorded, so you will have the opportunity to obtain the recording again later. And you have also the opportunity to ask David questions at the end of the webinar. We hold these until towards the end of his presentation. Some of you have sent in questions, and he has integrated those questions with answers into the presentation. But if you have any further questions, or if you feel that we haven't addressed those, we'll ask David at the end. So first of all, it gives me great pleasure today to welcome David. Afternoon.
Oh, thank you, Nicola. Very good afternoon to you, Nicola, and to everybody who's listening today.
David is a communication specialist, a coach and professional speaker, and he helps people to start conversations from cold with senior decision makers using the telephone. So drawing on his 20 years of experience, he will be taking us through some of the parts of his model so you can use it in your process to increase the power of the phone for you and help you remove the feeling of that cold calling again. It will also help those of you who want to increase your professional network, get more business, or make your next career move. So I'm going to start just by asking David a few questions so we can learn a little bit more about his background. And one of them is, so how did you become an expert in this niche area?
Well, Nicola, I've been cold calling for a number of years. And then I got a role at a subsidiary in the large software company Capgemini, and my role was to day in day out to cold call very senior people in large, so FTSE 100 and 250, to set up appointments for the sales team. And I was so good at it that they kept me doing it, and I got quite frustrated in my career. And in the spirit of one of the elements of this webinar, I wanted to make my next career move. So I was introduced to the wonderful communication discipline, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, or NLP. And on the third module of the course, I discovered that I had a model that could be broken down and given to other people so they could be trained and coached on how to, rather than cold call, but how to start conversations in a respectful way with very senior people in large groups, and particularly in order to generate large value deals.
And what would you say have been your greatest successes?
Well, my greatest successes have been, because I worked for a subsidiary of CAP, the types of companies I worked for were software companies. And what I discovered was that because of the discomfort in picking up the phone, most salespeople, or a lot of salespeople, tend to work at influencer level. So what this means is that the sales cycle can be particularly long. And also the deal size can be much smaller. So I discovered that by calling up to a much higher level and starting at board level, not only would the duration of the sales cycle be reduced, but also that the deal value could go up from an average of being £50,000 to £80,000 to £250,000 upwards.
That's great. I'm just quickly answering somebody who has a technical problem. So I will just let me do this.
So as Nicola does that, I'd just like to emphasize, is just notice where you are. Who are you actually talking to in your sales cycle? Are you talking to the influencer, or are you in fact avoiding talking to the decision maker because you feel too uncomfortable about calling in at that level?
Great. So over to you, David. We're going to start the presentation now, the webinar.
Okay.
And
no, that's lovely. Thank you, Nicola. Well, what I'd firstly like to say is whatever motivated you to come on this webinar, so whether it's that you want to develop your cold calling skills, or you want to make your next career move, or generate new business for your own business or for the business that you're working for, what I'd like you to do is to actually discard the current beliefs that you have about what's possible with what you're doing or what you're trying to achieve at the moment. And I want you to imagine that you have a magic wand, and just think what it would be like if you were able to pick up the phone and bring in £1 million worth of business. Or imagine if you could pick up the phone and make the right contacts at the right level to land your dream role. And if you work for yourself, rather than suffer the ups and downs of feast and famine in terms of how much work you've got, imagine that you could pick up the phone and use that to get a steady pipeline, which would enable you to have a steady stream of work. And if you're just starting off and you want to secure your first career post, wouldn't it be great if you could do that by making the right contacts and making a start in a career that you really, really wanted to do, rather than a career that you were pushed into doing? And lastly, but by no means least, just imagine how much time, and we're all very, very busy people and our schedules are very pressurized. Imagine what it would be like if you could save yourself hours of traveling time going to face-to-face meetings and do those meetings and have those meetings over the phone, what that would do for you in terms of your life. So just take a moment, and if you've got a piece of paper in front of you, just write down one outcome that if you were able to do this, what would you like? What would that be like, and what would that do for your life? And then what I'd like you to do is ask yourselves, what calls do you need to make in order to achieve those ideal outcomes? And this is probably quite an easy exercise, because when I do this presentation face-to-face to audiences, I have a telephone and I pretend to make a telephone call. And then I stop and I say, actually, I won't make this call, I'll go and check my spreadsheet, or I'll go and tidy my drawer. And everybody laughs, because everybody can relate to the fact that they know there are very important calls that they have to make to important people, but they find displacement activities. And I'm sure there's some of you that do that. So if you could make these calls, what would they do for you and do for your business? And lastly, if you could do more, use the telephone more as a business tool rather than an ad hoc communication device. And this is not just in a selling context, but also in your business generally. What would that do for you, and how would that make your life a lot easier? And then lastly, what I'd invite you to do is to think about, because I'm quite interested, I'm curious as to what impact this material that I'm going to give you today is going to have on you and your business, is think about, give yourself a score. So where 0 is you feel that you're not confident or comfortable at all in using the phone and calling people you don't know, and 10 is you're completely confident. Give yourself a score between 0 and 10. And towards the end of the webinar, what I'll do is I'll ask you again, is how comfortable do you feel now knowing what you do? And just notice the difference that this material is going to make in supporting you making those calls. So the good old coaching question is, what stops you? The two things that I've identified is, firstly, that nobody wants to feel like a cold caller. And the cold caller, we're all familiar with it, is the sort of person who calls you when you least want a call. It's just before you're going to eat, or just before you're going to go into an important meeting, and they drag you through their script. And in some way, what's very interesting when I work with executives or senior people about what stops them, is that they talk about, and I worked with a lady who was an ex-IT director of a large investment bank in the city. And she said, I can't possibly do this activity because I don't want to be one of them. And I said to her, I said, you'll never be one of them because you're respectful and your manner is courteous and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that there is a belief around that if we call someone that we don't know, that we're in some way going to adopt this very annoying behavior. So the first thing I'd say to you is throw off the cold calling hat. Throw away that identity, because I'm sure there is none of you out there who would behave like a cold caller. The second thing that stops us is this uncomfortable feeling. An old client of mine used to call it a wobbly feeling in his legs, and other clients talk about the really anxious, uncomfortable feeling in their stomachs. And that is what causes all this displacement activity, and finding other things that they can do rather than undergo this uncomfortable feeling. And what comes with that feeling is when you start to call people that you don't know, you have that quivering in your voice, you have the tightness in your stomach, the dryness in your mouth, and that is what stops you. So what I hope and trust that I'm going to give you today is that it's going to make you, the process and the tips and techniques that I'm going to give you are going to make you feel more confident and comfortable. And you've got a process that you can go through where you feel that you're not going to be pestering people, but you're going to actually providing great value to them when you call them. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, David, so what is this better way? Come on, tell me now, what do you do, and what's the process, and what do you go through? A lot of this you will know, but there is one thing about knowing things and another about doing it. And the most obvious thing that people don't do is that they don't do their homework, they don't do their research about who they're going to call, and they don't do the research about the business that they're going to call. And I'm sure, to put this into context, that if we think about what a classical cold call is about, it's all about the salesperson, it's all about their product, and it's all about the service. And what you need to think about is about leading with information that is all about them and their business, not you and your product. So once you've done your research, what you need to do is to actually almost physically stand in their shoes and ask yourself, what do they need to hear to become interested in your product or service, or indeed your skills if you're looking to change career. And ask yourself the good old coaching question, is if I were in their shoes, would I listen to me? And the distillation of the research that you should be doing, I call, is usually one sentence, I call a valid business reason or a valid listening reason. So a good example of this is looking through, and we have boundless opportunity now to do this research with the internet, and of course with social media, and Twitter feeds and Facebook and LinkedIn. There's lots of information that we can glean, not only about the decision makers that we want to contact, but also the businesses in which they work. And once we have this information, I distill this into, as I say, a valid business reason or a valid listening reason. So an example of that would be a business opening, expanding into Northern Europe, or merging with another company, or getting a second injection of venture capitalist funds. All of these things are great valid business reasons or listening reasons. And lastly, the other thing that people seldom seem to do when they're using the telephone to initiate new relationships from cold is that they don't plan their calls or indeed rehearse them. So if you were doing a face-to-face presentation to a group of people, you wouldn't dream, I'm sure you wouldn't dream, of going in front of people without actually rehearsing it and preparing it. So it's all about working out the call route, the possible route that the call could take, the possible objections that might be given. And I do this using the process of mind mapping. And I find this really effective because as the ideas come into my head, I just map them out in front of me. And the acid test for me of whether I have this right is that when I run the call in my head, if I have done it correctly, I will get a very light candy floss or excited feeling at the top of my chest. And if I get it wrong and I haven't prepared it correctly, then I get this horrible anxious feeling in the pit of my stomach. So it's quite interesting if we go back to my point about what stops people picking up the phone. It's very often because they feel that they shouldn't be calling people. There's that uncomfortable feeling, but if you have it right, and here's another lovely piece of feedback that one of my clients gave me. He said, ever since I've been implementing this whole process of research, David, and finding a valid business reason, he said, I feel that the people I'm calling would be crazy not to listen to me because there is such a great value proposition between what I'm offering and the research that I've gleaned about what is important to them in their business right now. A number of you have sent in questions around gatekeepers, and gatekeepers is a favorite topic within the whole area of cold calling or starting conversations from cold. Years and years ago, when I first started doing cold calling working and teleselling work and telemarketing, the conventional wisdom was about how to get past the gatekeeper. And I found this incredibly stressful, incredibly tiring, and very, very time-consuming. And what I discovered is actually, going back to my point about a better way, the better way is actually to transform a gatekeeper into a gate opener. And there's a whole module of this in my training program, which is on my website, which is how you build rapport with the senior executives and you get them to help you to open the door to the decision maker. And first of all, my first tip would be stop seeing them as gatekeepers and see them as allies, people who will help you reach the person that you need to speak to. And what you can do is get them to set up the appointment for you, get the necessary material to the decision maker. And once you've actually developed the relationship and you've won the business, they can be absolutely fantastic in other practical support in getting your invoices paid on time. So how does this work? Let me give you some of the practical process, because I'm sure some of you are saying, well, how does this work? This is all very well and good. Well, once you've done your research, what I typically do is I go to the assistant, the PA, to the chief executive or to the managing director. And the first thing I say to them is, my name's David Fastenstein, I'm calling from XYZ company, can you help me? And that's the first thing I say, because what I want to do is to establish where their world is, what are they doing at the time. And the second thing I do then is to listen to their voice tone, because their voice tone is going to give me lots of information of what their world is, what are they up to, whether they're busy, whether they're stressed, or whether they're able to take my call. If they are receptive, then what I say is, I'm calling you about, and then I cite the research, the valid business reason or listening reason that that I found, so your expansion into Europe, your second injection of venture capitalist funding, whatever it is that you found out. And this is very much our area of expertise. We have skills or products or services that can support this. Could you be so kind to tell me who would be the right person to talk to about potentially doing business or working for you? And at that point, what they will do is they will give me the name of the decision maker and their secretary or assistant, and they will give me the contact details. And then I have a choice. I can contact the decision maker directly, or I can work through the secretary. In the old days, what I used to do was to contact the decision maker directly. But now what I do, and here's the interesting thing for you, you can actually make this process work for you in the main, not always, but in the main by just building good relationships with executive secretaries and getting them to do the work for you. So typically now, for myself and for my clients, what I do is I go to the secretary of the decision maker and I say something along the lines, I've been referred to you by the chief executive secretary or the managing director's secretary. I understand Mr. or Mrs. or Mercer, whoever it is, decision maker is responsible for this area of the business, whatever it is, the area you want to work in. What we'd like to do at a more convenient time is to set up a brief telephone meeting of 15 to 20 minutes in order to establish how we might be able to help. And that's what I do. And in order to support that, and of course some of you have asked this question about, do you call directly, do you send emails, do you leave messages? What I do is, and the usual response to that is, please can you send through an email to that effect with the background. So I sent through an email, it's a tailored email, citing my referral from the Chief Exec Secretary, citing my valid business reason, how that links in with their current business climate, and then requesting the dedicated slot for me to be able to talk to the decision maker. So all your fears about rejection, calling someone at the wrong time, can be completely got rid of if you follow the process. And that's if it works perfectly. That's the ideal process. But a lot of you say, okay, well that's fine, but in a busy large organization that doesn't always work. And that's absolutely right. It doesn't always work. You can come across very often voicemail as another block or potential block. And what I've discovered with years of testing this is that voicemail, again, can be your greatest ally. What I've discovered is why voicemail doesn't work is, and again, if you think about your own business and your own life, why you don't return voicemail, it is very often because the voicemail is always couched in terms of what the other person wants, their agenda, and it doesn't strike a chord with you, and therefore you don't return it, or you return it at a much, much later date, if at all. So the secret, again, is about leaving a voicemail which is about them and their business, not you, your product, or your skills which you wish to promote. So typically the type of voicemail that I would leave would be, hello, my name's David Festenstein. If I have a referral from the chairman or the chief executive secretary, I will cite that. I'm calling you further to, speaking to the chief executive secretary, and it's with reference to your second round of venture capitalist funding. I have a very quick query that I would like to ask you. Could you be so kind to return my call? My number is, and I say 01923 663 275, and I repeat it again. And I know this is such an obvious point, but if you think about the number of times you get voicemail where someone leaves voicemail where they say, my name is calling for and could you call me back on blah, 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 and it's completely unintelligible, and you think, why should I play this 3 or 4 times in order to establish the number? So leave your number very clearly, and at the end of which what I say is, and I look forward to hearing from you. So the presupposition is that what I've said deserves my call to be returned. And very often it is. Now, sometimes it isn't returned. People are very busy. They have far more important things to do than respond to my voicemail. So what I do is I keep leaving messages at weekly intervals, so I don't hound people, and I leave it in a very respectful way. So I say, I'm so sorry I've missed you. Once again, I'm calling further, and I repeat the message. And then I keep doing that weekly intervals until I actually get hold of the person. And what this does is it actually enables me to build virtual rapport. So by the time I get hold of them, they're incredibly responsive. Say, oh, David, I'm so sorry. I've been so busy. Have been meaning to return your call. And then we can start the conversation. So voicemail can be very, very effective if you're using it properly. Get into the right state. What do we mean by this? Well, the right state is your energy level and how you feel. And why is that so important? It is so important because, as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, is how you feel will affect how you sound, and in turn will affect the outcomes that you get from your calls. I remember years ago I was listening to Tony Robbins. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, the great personal development guru, and he said something really interesting. He said most cold calls fail because people sound boring. And that is a really good way of thinking about it. If your energy level is low, and if you're feeling like you really don't want to be doing this in the first place, then check in with that, because the impact of every telephone conversation, this is the scary bit, is affected by your delivery up to 70%. So it is not so much what you say, but how you say it. So be very mindful of that. So if you've done your research and you know that you have a great value proposition when approaching companies from cold, then make sure that your energy level is at the right level. So, and we're all different, so make sure I would advise you to do your calls when you're feeling your best. Ideally, after you've done some exercise or you've taken a break, but if that's not practical, then get up from your desk, move around, change your physiology, and take 10 deep breaths. And as you do so, as you're exhaling, think about the value and focus on the outcomes that you want from the call, and you'll get a far, far better result. And lastly, another very good technique is to think about calls that have gone, very well in the past, and think about what specifically you did and what you said in order to get those outcomes, and use that confidence when you go into your new calls. Another point that goes with this is be very curious of what's your delivery. So how you deliver. So you must have the right energy, but also the texture of your delivery. And again, we're all different, and we all have natural delivery styles. So some of us, as you notice from my voice, speak very slowly and deliberately. Other people who process visually speak very quickly. So be mindful about what your natural delivery style is. Those people that you build rapport with very well will be very much like you. They'll have a similar style. And when dealing quite often with decision makers and difficult people, you'll need to change your speed, your volume, your pace and tone and match that. So for example, I'll give you an example. When I was doing this really difficult selling business development work at CAP, I held the belief that I couldn't deal with very, very senior decision makers who had very aggressive tones. So what I needed to do was change my voice tone so that not that I became aggressive, but I was able to match the aggression with a neutral tone that would push this aggression back. And what that enabled me to do was to build rapport very well with them and get some great outcomes. So be curious about your delivery style and ask yourself the great coaching question, what do I need to change in order to be in sync? Just one final point on that before I go on to talk about telephone meetings. What I would encourage all of you on the call to do is record your calls. And I know you're all in different parts of the world, so be mindful of the regulations around recording. But recording your calls, you can get the most fantastic feedback, and recording equipment can be your most brutal coach. And that way you can get a greater understanding of what's working in your calls, what's not working, and what you need to do more of and less of. So moving on to telephone meetings. Telephone meetings are a great way of saving time. Remember we were saying about how you can change your life literally by not traveling hundreds of miles and sometimes getting on planes in order to go to face-to-face meetings. What I discovered, this came again from my work at CAP, is that we were working with a potential client base that had a very wide geographical distribution. And in some cases, I was sending salespeople hundreds of miles across the country in order to get these fantastic meetings with these very senior people. However, the meetings would go well, but sometimes, not always, there wasn't necessarily an opportunity at that time. And the sales director had this brainwave. He said, why don't we qualify these, not simply just in a telephone call, but in a telephone meeting? So what I started to do was to ask for 10, 15 minutes for a dedicated slot that had the same texture and status of a face-to-face meeting. So what we would do, we would get the personal assistant to confirm them the day before. We would send in documentation and ask the PA to make sure that the person had looked at the documentation, so that when the salesperson called, there was a dedicated 15-minute slot to talk about, and there was a fixed agenda around, and again, this would all slot in with the research and the valid business reason, to go through and talk that through to see how they could support their current business initiatives. And this was very, very successful. So I would encourage you to do this. I know a lot of you who are visual, process visually, saying, but I do much better if I sit in front of someone and I can see their body language. But if you work with the recording device and you start to train your ear to listen for voice tone as an indication of interest rather than body language, you will begin to become very skilled at picking up interest through voice tone rather than visual cues. And again, as I say, the benefit from this is saving yourself hundreds of hours of traveling time, as well as obviously the traveling itself. Interestingly, if you think about it, it does also give you a competitive advantage, because most salespeople have the belief that in order to engage with someone, it must be a face-to-face meeting. And the other interesting thing is that if you ask for a small amount of time initially, so if you ask for 15, 20 minutes or 10, 15 minutes, when you actually go to book that call, the secretary will offer you a far larger time slot. So in my experience, you ask for 10, 15 minutes, and they give you half an hour. If you ask for 15 to 20 minutes, they can sometimes give you up to an hour. So if you have an hour dedicated slot with a very senior decision maker, just think what you can achieve in that time slot. So at this point, you're probably saying, okay, David, so give me some examples of how this has worked. The first one I'd like to mention is a gentleman who worked for a large PLC. It was a search and selection company. He had teams of people. He worked across Europe. He had teams of people who would make calls for him. And then he decided to set up on his own. And it was at that point he realized that he hadn't really done any cold calling or started conversations from cold. And this actually held him with horror how he was going to do it. So what I did was I worked with him over a number of days. We went through this process that I've been explaining to you. And what was interesting, his indicator was he kept talking about feeling wobbly in his legs. And as we worked through the process and we worked through the research and he built up his confidence, he was able to make regular calls on a daily basis. And after 6 weeks of calling, he managed to close a deal of £35,000, and it was for a search for a large venture capitalist company in Europe, which he was absolutely delighted with. In contrast, I did some work with one of the top 50 accountancy firms. They had the classic problem where they had a large database of new prospects, and they were farming these prospects, and the conversion was very, very low. And what I discovered, it was classic high volume calling, what I call spraying and praying. So calling large numbers of people, promoting the products and services and getting lots and lots of rejection, which is soul destroying for whoever is doing it. So when we implemented my process of making the approach around them and their business rather the product or service, we got dramatic change in results. And I remember I was working on a 6-week project with them, and one client, a very large client, we were able to close. After 6 weeks, we got an initial order of £30,000, and they were the managing director of that division was absolutely delighted because he said that they had been trying to get in there for over a year. The third example is a personal one, which is very interesting if you've ever had problems where you bought something or you're very unhappy with a service. It's a large telecoms company, and it was the company that provided my mother and father with the telephone company that they used at the time. And the problem was that my father was very unwell at the time, and my mother was trying to get through to the doctor's surgery and speak to the doctor. And every time she did, the line would go very quiet. So she went through the normal procedure of contacting the call center, and they would send out a number of engineers, and each time the engineer would come around, he'd say he'd fix it, or he tried to fix it, and the problem would reoccur. And this went on for 3 months. And in the end, I said to my mother, I said, Mum, I think what we need to do is to get to someone on the board or someone very senior in this company. And this is one of the largest telecoms companies in the world. And even for me, I thought this was quite a daunting task. So what I did was I went to Google and I typed in customer services director of this large telecoms company. And I was blessed because what came up was the name of the customer services director along with a link to a PowerPoint presentation that she had recently made to the board of directors. And what was fascinating about this PowerPoint presentation is that there were 2 particularly relevant slides. One was about how the company wanted to improve the access of the customer to the company overall. And secondly, about how they wanted to reduce repeatable problems. So what I did was I found out the number of the company's headquarters in the city, and I called up and I asked to speak to this customer services director. And the switchboard was very blocking, to say the least, and they were quite snooty. And if I wasn't used to it, I would have been made to feel very, very uncomfortable. And so the receptionist said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a customer of the company." And she said, "And what's it concerning?" I said, "Oh, it's to do with her presentation to the board." And at that point, she backed down and said, "Okay, that's fine. I'll put you through." And I thought she'd put me through to the secretary, but in fact, she put me straight through to the person herself. So I started off, I introduced myself, and I said we were customers of this company. Listened to her voice tone as I said that in response. Clearly she was receptive, so I carried on. So I said the reason I'm calling was with respect to her presentation to the board, cited the 2 slides regarding how they wanted to improve their customer access and repeatable problems. And then I introduced what it was that I wanted. I said that we were on our knees with this problem. I explained the problem that my mother was going through, and she got it in one, and she apologized profusely, and she said, Mr. Bessenstein, leave this with me and I will get this sorted out, I promise you. I must have made the call about 11 o'clock in the morning. I went down the gym at lunchtime, came back, there was a very long message on my answer machine from one of her directors saying that he'd done all the research on the problem with the calls and the system, and they would have it fixed by late afternoon. And to their word, they had it fixed by 4 or 4:30, and it did not reoccur. And the icing on the cake was that she rang me 3 or 4 days later. She said, I'm just calling you to check that your problem has been resolved, which I thought was lovely. So if you have any customer service issue, that is a very, very good way of getting through to someone who can do something about it, and I have used that many times. And then lastly, not because I'm mindful of time, is that what's interesting in a lot of my work is that working with software companies, we were able to reduce the sales cycle, in some cases up to 50%, and increase the deal size by 2 to 3-fold. So, in summary, think about all your calls, do your research, and when you make your approaches, when you're starting a conversation from cold, ensure that it is about them and their life and their business. Again, to stress, you have so much information. Look at Twitter. I mean, follow people's Twitter feeds as an example. Look at the type of language that people use. What is very, very powerful, if you take chunks of people's language and you cite it back to them, you quote it back to them, that is a very powerful way of engaging with people. When you hear your own language played back to you, you emotionally engage with the person who is using it. So there is another very good tip for you. Always when you're approaching people, particularly from cold, think about their world in relation to your own. One of the mistakes we often make is when we're very, very enthusiastic about what it is that we want to promote. We often miss what is being told to us, and that's why I say record your calls so you can listen to everything, things that you might have missed in the call. Be very watchful about your state and your energy level, because that can have so much impact in terms of the call outcomes. And overall, keep a log of what works and what doesn't. And I think one good tip to give you is if you work for yourself and you're not doing this all the time, see if you can make between 5 new calls a day and 5 follow-ups a day. And if you do that religiously, you will have a really good pipeline. So there's another really good tip for you. So in addition to what I've told you, I'd love to help you further if you need or want help. What I'm going to do is to make available what was my CD-ROM, the whole process of what I've told you today in far more detail in the downloadable, and when we send out the details of the recording, I will give you links and details to that. I also run teleclasses, half-day workshops, and do one-to-one telecoaching. I'm an executive coach, so not only can I work with you on these particular on this particular process, but also work with you on general personal development subjects and issues as well. Here are my contact details, and I'll be asking the business school to send these out with the recording as well. So if there are any further questions or any queries, or any way I can help you further, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. So what I'd like to do now is to hand you back to Nicola to see whether we have covered all the questions within my presentation, and also to see if there are any further questions that have recently come in, which I can answer for you.
Thank you very much, David. That's fantastic and gives a great overview on starting conversations from cold, and I think gives many pointers to help people feel more comfortable with that and getting them on their way to securing new business and maybe their next position. In fact, we've got, I think, most of your questions. There were quite a few pre-questions about gatekeepers, and I think you've really covered those. So what I would ask is if anybody feels that there's a particular slant in terms of the gatekeeper question that hasn't been covered, could you send through your question? There is one that there's a question that's come through online, and there's also another one that maybe I will ask, because we have talked. You did talk about sending on the email and voice messages, but someone says more and more often the gatekeeper will ask for an email, which defeats the object of trying to call directly. So how do you avoid this, or how do you get past the gatekeeper? So I think you've kind of talked about using the gatekeeper and in fact developing that as a relationship. But do you feel any pitfalls in the fact that you do have to send an email? Is that a problem, do you feel?
No, I think we were talking about this earlier, is that I think my belief is that you can do this whole process from beginning to end simply, and I say simply, by building rapport with the gatekeepers and transforming them into gate openers, so that they will sponsor the email and get it in front of the decision maker. Now, that's not to say that there are person assistants who won't be helpful. But I approach this work on the basis that there will be people out there who will help me, and as I hold that belief, there are people who will help me. No, I would say no. It doesn't defeat. The alternative, Nicola, is to try and catch these people when you can. And the problem is that they're so busy. Is that if you try and hold a conversation when they're not receptive, then you just get immediate knockback. Or the other frustrating thing is they say, call me back, and you just keep chasing them. And that can be, firstly, very draining, and secondly, very time consuming. So the email actually is a good thing and to welcome. But what I would add to it, which is an important thing to test, whether this person is going to become a gate opener, is actually say to them, certainly I will send through this email, I will give back that book background and the value proposition which I believe we had. When would be a good time to call you back in order to be able to book a specific slot with Mr. or Mrs. or whoever it is? I think that would be my counsel.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's also a question that's come through about recruitment consultants. So how would you make a cold call to a recruiter if you're interested in getting a new job? Could you give us an example?
I think that's a great question. I would say what's really, I would, first of all, this takes me back many years. When I first came back from, just give you a bit of background. When I first came back from Greece, I was trying to get work here in the UK, and I must have spent the best part of 6 to 8 months trying to work through recruitment consultants and recruitment companies to get work. And as many times as I sent out CVs, they would come back with rejections through the letterbox. Unless you have, but notwithstanding, if you have specific skills which you feel, and again this is back to your world, my world, if you feel that this particular recruiter or consultancy are very interested in your type of skills, then I would encourage you to go ahead and do it. Otherwise, I would encourage you to do it the other way. I think you will, by doing it the other way, is that you avoid the competition, you go to the top of the list. But in order, if you do want to go the recruitment way, what I would encourage you to do is to do your research on that recruiter and look at their interests. I mean, I have a very close, that chap I did that work with, he's a very keen amateur musician, and he gets, I think he was saying he gets between 80 and 100 emails a day from people asking him for work. But he said that someone called him and started the conversation from cold, talking about his passion for a particular band. And he said he really engaged with that person and he really helped them. So that would be my my counsel to you. Find out about them as individuals and find out about consultancy. So when you start the conversation, it's all about them rather than the role that you're looking for, if that makes sense.
The other thing I would add to that is that the other week we had David Pullinger from the careers team talking about making a career change. There are some webinars on informational interviewing, making a career change on the alumni website. They all can be re-listened to, and he gives very good advice on specifically getting positions and getting new jobs. And you can always make a one-to-one appointment with our careers team as well. Are there any other questions that anyone has? I think we've just about covered everything that was asked beforehand. Some people have said, is there any particular time of the day, the week that it's best to do your cold calling?
No, that's a really good question. Yes, it's what I got great results with, and it's always interesting that people form beliefs about. There's always a good time. Well, it's not always times. Well, let me start by saying when I was doing it that way, I found first thing Monday morning was very good. And by first thing, I mean from 7:45 to 8:30, because a lot of senior people are coming in to prepare for meetings. And then last thing on a Friday, about 4 o'clock, 4:30, because it's the end of the week. And if they're around, they're in a good mood because it's the weekend, or potentially in a good mood. But also remember that things happen, and there's stresses and strains on individuals, so they can be grumpy or unreceptive at any time. And that's why I urge you to hone that skill in listening to voice tone. When someone picks up the phone, listen to the voice tone. That will give you the clue of what their world is like.
I think that's just about everything covered. I'm looking at the questions, but I think David's covered them all in his presentation. And what I would say is that David used all these techniques to get through to me. I'm thinking back, and absolutely down to a T. He didn't come straight through to me. He went to the PA, to the principal, and then got referred through to me, and he's followed all these techniques. So it does work, and we're very happy to have him with us today. I just want to also say that next year we'll be developing our webinar offer. We're going to get faculty master classes on webinars and alumni panels. So please do respond to the evaluation form when we send it through to you, and also give us feedback on potential future subjects and deliveries and topics, because we would like to hear from you. So I'm going to thank everybody now for joining us today. Thank David again. I hope you've got a lot out of it, and please keep registering and coming along to our webinars. Thank you very much. Goodbye.